In this part of my tutorial, I'm going to show how to add the front seats and the steering wheel to the Vega interior. These seats are actually from one of my Redline projects. They're supposed to be C3 Corvette seats, the standard seats. As you can see, the scale is off because Redline scaling is kind of strange. So I rescaled them there, and I'm installing them. I've noticed that a lot of Vegas now in existence have Corvette seats or seats sometimes from Monte Carlos. I don't know to what extent this was done originally, whether these would be original equipment. Because as I've said before, parts for Vegas are very scarce. So I imagine that a lot of hot rodders and a lot of restorers use parts from other cars from time to time if they can't find originals. But in any case, I know they would be buckets, so I'm using the Corvette seats for lack of something better. Anyway, I have now made everything the same object using the join feature, and also made them all the same material. That will matter later for UV mapping, among other things. This is the steering column, or what will be the steering column. So it's a cylinder, and obviously I have to scale and stretch, as I've done with other shafts in the interior. The measurements are probably wrong, as before, but it's a guess, and what I presume is that over the longer term, I would be able to rescale this if I had the measurements, because it won't be radically off. I'm basically scaling it by eye in proportion to everything else. So it should more or less be, I don't know what you would say, correctable in the future. So here I have to move it down into the dashboard model, which is a similar situation. It's proportional, but probably not exactly accurate in measurements, but close enough. I should be able to fix it later if necessary. Or rather, if possible. I think it is necessary, but I'm doing what is possible here. So a little more scaling. I based this a lot on the Hot Rod magazine photo that you saw in earlier videos of the interior with the rectangular horizontal speedometer. You can sort of see the outline of it there in the dash. I'm not going to model all the details of that, incidentally. That'll be part of the texture, which is one of the many compromises you make in 3D modeling, of course. Reduce polys. So here I'm moving the column to a more or less accurate position. And then I model the single spoke of the steering wheel by extruding from the shaft. As far as I know, this was, if not unique to the Vega, then at least not used on every General Motors car. There were a lot of General Motors cars that had this arrangement with just a single spoke horizontally for many years, actually, but there were many different models of steering wheel used. At first I thought this might be the same steering wheel as was used, for example, in the 1975 Buick Skylark, but I looked more carefully at the photos, and that's not the case. It's apparently distinct. And it's also not the only steering wheel that was installed in the Vega. It just looks to be more or less the standard for 1971. So I'm talking a lot here because on screen you can see I am going through the slow, laborious process of building the shape of this steering column spoke, which, like a lot of things in the interior, is more complicated than it looks at first glance. Scaling it in proportion to the column is tricky. So I'm compromising between scaling the single spoke and scaling the column. Eventually I'll extrude the plane that it is now into a box, of course. I'm going to have higher standards than I had when I was modeling for Redline. Usually the steering wheels in Redline, mine and other people's, were actually two-dimensional images that had alphas to make them transparent so that you had the illusion of them being 3D models. It saved on polys and so on and made it easier to animate them. But in this case, I'm going to model the whole steering wheel because it's not clear that I'm going to be using this in a Redline car. I mean, if I do build a Redline car out of the Vega model, it will be modified in several different ways, not just the steering wheel, but also the wheels, because the wheel models are separate in Redline from the body model, and the interior model is also separate. In this project, I'm going to try to install this interior into the existing exterior model, but in Redline it would remain separate. So here I'm trying to put the arch in the top of this single spoke. Kind of defies our mental image of a spoke because it's more of a box of sorts. It's a very similar design to what was used in the Knight 2000 from the Knight Rider TV series, except that car did not have a wheel. It only had handles at the end of this spoke, much like an aircraft yoke. So here I'm subdividing to curve it a little bit more cleanly, and as well as more accurately, because there are notches at the ends. It's not a perfect arch, actually. If you want to do this right, you have to have it notched at the ends, as you'll see in a second. There, like that, more or less. I'm probably not doing it perfectly. Here I'm taking a more careful look at it. So then I select the whole thing and I can manipulate the whole thing simultaneously. Side view and extrude. And then we have the box that is the single spoke. But I have to rescale it here. Not really that boxy in real life. Again, the measurements are odd. I mean, I don't know if my measurements here are correct. I really need drawings to do this correctly. This is all more or less eyeing it from the photograph. This donut, if that's the right word for it, will become the steering wheel. I had to be rather careful in how I scaled this actually, because it is, as you can see, multiple segments. If you scale everything at once, as you can see, you don't necessarily change the proportions. In fact, you do not change the proportions. You only change the overall size. So what can happen is you can end up with it being too fat, too skinny. So I don't like scaling things in Blender by one axis except using the arrows. But with a donut, it's especially difficult to do that. You're basically using two different arrows at once. So it can really be a pain actually to do this right. So I'm moving it into place, and again, I'm eyeing it. So I have to line it up and then make a judgment. Which, as long as I don't have the drawings, is never going to be 100%, unfortunately. Note to anybody doing a professional job of building a game, you want to get your drawings and use your company's resources to get your hands on those drawings. I'd imagine that General Motors has a library somewhere where you could find the Vega drawings. So there I've made the wheel skinnier than it has to be because I'm going to scale it out, see? And then I have to line it up with the spoke because what should be self-explanatory is not. So in the next video, I'll have to cover the detailing of this because I'm out of time.